Hi, and welcome to the Academy. This is our first module titled Feeding and Eating Foundation, where we will discuss different anxieties and approaches that come into our feeding relationship with our child. Up until this point, I know that there are a variety of different starting points that each of you come into the Academy with for your family. I know that for some of you, you've had a long history of feeding challenges, and for some of you, a picky eating season is newly upon you and you're wanting some strategies out of it. And regardless of where you come at things from today, I think it's important for us to start with the anxieties that we as parents face as well as those that our children face, so that we can take a little bit of an underlying understanding of some of the interplays that are occurring at mealtimes with our own insecurities and anxieties as parents, and taking a better understanding to our children's as well. And understanding these anxieties and some of the pressures that often unconsciously come into meal times can really help us gain a better understanding as to why we use the feeding approaches that we do, either historically or moving forward with some of those that we might be tempted to also lean on or resort back to. Up until this point, often many of us have just taken snippets of advice and blended that with the different anxieties and insecurities that we've accrued from challenges in the feeding relationship and come up with a little bit of a mixed bag of feeding strategies. So my goal for us this week is for us to work through this first module and better understand some of our underlying mindset that plays into the feeding relationship for ourselves, understand where our children are coming at the feeding relationship from as well, and then most importantly, to give you some more productive, positive approaches to move forward with so that we can start the feeding relationship and our work in the Academy off on a great foot. In one of my favorite books for families with picky eaters, with this resource shown here, you can see that they share this worry cycle. And if you look at this, you can see that oftentimes there's a feeding challenge that is the impetus for some sort of worry to then cycle through. And so for some of us, this might have been as new parents, we immediately faced challenges feeding our child. It might have been something like your child wasn't able to take a bottle, struggled nursing, was unable to accept solids or transition to different textures, or maybe they struggled with accepting and transitioning overall to table foods. And whatever it was, oftentimes this type of initial feeding challenge might have been something that was identified as an issue by another health professional or someone that you were able to go to. But even if you were able to identify it, oftentimes the amount of time and energy and honestly anxiety that's created throughout that process as a parent can really wear on our hearts and souls and minds as parents in the way that we initially enter into the feeding relationship. And so if we think of the process it took for you to identify that there was an issue and not just have worry or concern over, is this even an issue, especially if you were a new parent and maybe didn't know what to expect with the feeding relationship or your child's introduction to breastfeeding or bottles or formula, or maybe they had a food intolerance or an allergy that went undiagnosed for a long time. Any of these founded feeding challenges from the get-go can begin to shape how we perceive our feeding relationship early on. And some of these anxieties of worry or not having enough information or feeling a lack of support, that might be from family or friends who just don't understand or aren't involved in it on a day-to-day basis, or it might be a lack of support from your allied healthcare team. Sometimes there's just not enough resources in our areas to get the support that we feel we need for whatever that initial feeding challenge is with our child. You add on to this that oftentimes there's poor advice that comes into play, whether it was unsolicited or solicited advice from medical professionals who maybe aren't privy to the challenges that we're facing. And you can see how very quickly a parent can begin to adopt counterproductive feeding practices. And as those are adopted and the child begins to resist those counterproductive feeding practices, you can see how the worry cycle begins to spiral. And it's met with more pressure, more worry from the parents, and then ultimately more resistance and reluctance to eat from the child. This might also have been something where a feeding challenge presented a little bit later. Maybe there was not some biological challenge that presented in infancy or early toddlerhood, but maybe it's just been as your child grew older, you assumed that your child would grow out of some of their picky eating tendencies. If this is the case, again, the worry cycle can still be perpetuated by whatever your initial feeding challenge was, and the allied worry and lack of information, lack of support, lack of quality evidence-based advice that compel us often to adopt counterproductive feeding habits. Oftentimes we do this as a one-off or a one-time thing, thinking we just need to get through this meal. As parents, we don't mean to be short-sighted, but we often are looking for the easy day-to-day wins. And if we don't take a step back and evaluate how this can perpetuate a negative worry cycle and perpetuate long-term pressure, long-term worry, and ultimately long-term resistance from our child in the eating relationship, we can quickly lose touch of how complex of a cycle this can really become for our family. With this, I want to go ahead and jump in and evaluate some of the most common overarching trends that we see with where a parent's anxiety stems from. Again, referencing to the book of Helping Your Child with Extreme Picky Eating, it shares a little bit more on the first 5 of these, and then I've added a few others that I see in my own practice coming up a lot with families, and I've already heard from many of you, are general concerns or areas that create anxiety for you in the feeding relationship. Some of these might stem from worries about nutrition. That could be something like your child's concerned that they're not getting enough vitamin D or calcium or iron or protein, or if your child maybe is low weight or has had a history of weight loss, you might be really concerned about the amount of calories they consume, especially in this day and age. We're seeing more and more of a concern with families towards the additives that are in child's food and really trying to look into finding the most healthy and natural food sources available. Another concern that can create a lot of anxiety for families are families that are dealing with allergies or intolerances. And if you have a history of a child, particularly with an anaphylactic allergy, understandably, you're probably entering into your feeding relationship with your child, and the foundation for your feeding relationship is probably a little bit anxious due to the fact that they have a life-threatening allergy. And so some of these, again, can be more founded in a true food allergy, and some of them can be more unfounded anxieties that just come from fear and concern, lack of information, and lack of support towards, is your child getting enough vitamin D? Is your child getting enough iron? Is your child getting enough protein? And not necessarily knowing what the proper answer is. And so it's very easy for our mindsets as parents to begin to spiral out of control in that worry cycle and to begin to maladapt our feeding behaviors so that we pressure our children to eat more foods that are rich in those nutrients that we're concerned our children aren't getting enough of. Other areas of anxiety that we often see are areas of being judged. This might come from our children's pediatrician. We might either have a fear that they would judge us, or historically there might have been an instance where we felt that we were judged by our child's pediatrician, or if you've sought out expertise or advice or second opinions from specialists, there might be worries about being judged by them. There also often is a fear of judgment that creates anxiety around what our in-laws think or our own parents think, or how we feed our children differently than maybe grandparents did, also with friends and the different feeding styles that exist out there. And oftentimes if we see friends who have quote unquote good eaters and we don't feel that our child is, we can inadvertently be judging ourselves and be very anxious that our friends are judging us based off of how our children eat. This also might come into play with schools. We may feel that our children's school or preschool or daycare facility is judging us based off the type of foods we send. We may feel anxious towards they are looking at what we send in the lunchbox and thinking, how could we be sending these things, when deep down we have anxiety that these are the only foods our children will be eating. So again, each of these easily gets dismissed in the hustle and bustle of the day, but we're going to be walking through each of these anxieties because they are important factors into what is shaping and what is driving and ultimately what is some of the underlying motivation or fear that you have in feeding your child. Also, parents can have anxiety about relapse. If your child has historically been diagnosed with failure to thrive or had a feeding tube, or if they've been in feeding therapy and have moved out of either these diagnoses or medical needs, and you have a fear of going back to those seasons, going back to a state where your child is low on the growth curve with weight that is plateauing, or you have a fear of relapsing and having to get a feeding tube either restarted, maybe the feeding tube is still in place but not being used right now, or getting a feeding tube placed again. That would understandably be a huge area of anxiety. Also, if your child has graduated from feeding therapy, you might have anxiety towards them not progressing enough or being able to maintain progress enough on their own and not wanting to go back to that season. Also, Parents often can get anxious just about the behavior of a child in general. Children obviously can have lots of tears and temper tantrums, particularly when boundaries are set and established and maintained. And so if you have anxiety about those adverse behaviors that your child might do in the case of you setting those limits around different feeding behaviors and foods that are offered and things like that, that might be something that is perpetuating some of your counterproductive feeding behaviors, particularly if you're anxious towards behaviors that might happen in public, whether that be around family or at holiday gatherings or in public at a restaurant or even around spouses. This can be a big area of parent anxiety. Sometimes what we see is that a parent might be able to handle some of these behaviors in private on their own and just accept it as part of their life right now. But when others are around, those behaviors become more embarrassing or a greater source of anxiety for the parent. Also, parents can feel a lot of anxiety towards the fact that we do not have a lot of control over if, whether, and how much our kids eat. We would like to have control over that. We would like to be able to control the amount that our child is eating so that we have a little bit greater sense of security, but we also have to grapple with that anxiety of us having lack of control in that area, and that can be a challenge for parents also. Additionally, the concern and the anxiety that can come from feeling as one of our primary roles as parents is to nourish our children. Oftentimes I hear from parents say that they feel really guilty if their child doesn't eat what was offered, or that they blame themselves for their child feeling hungry after a meal if the meal was not that child's favorite or something that they chose to eat. And so having a lot of anxiety towards a sense of failure, of not being able to fulfill one of our main duties as a parent, to nourish our child, can be another primary source of anxiety. And then lastly, another thing that can cause a lot of anxiety for families that we'll talk about today would be rejection. And that might be just the feeling of defeat and the anxiety that that creates when we feel that we've invested time and energy and money and resources in the foods that we've bought and prepared that then go uneaten, and the anxiety that comes with, what if my child doesn't even eat this? And then what is my response going to be to all of that rejected food and produced food waste? So the reason I start off with addressing this is because very quickly we can see how these anxieties are things that that I can begin to identify about each one of you very quickly. In speaking with each of you or in reading introductions about families from the Academy, I can begin to identify what some of the underlying anxieties are for you. And I don't share this as a bad thing, but I share this as something that I think is very insightful and worth observing about, not only from me to you, but also with you of yourself and you of your family, to realize what some of those bigger anxiety trigger points are for you, so that you can understand what those deeper worries are for you that are likely driving some of the behaviors that you've attempted before and likely been unsuccessful with, leading you up to this point. If we flip the coin and we begin to look at what is potentially creating anxiety for our child and what they're presenting with when they come to the table, we can begin to consider some of the factors that might be impacting negatively their appetite or interest in the food that we're offering. Things like the developmental need for independence and autonomy. Oftentimes when we begin to see, or I should say hear, the word no being used more often, oftentimes tends to be when picky eating presents more commonly in kids. While this is very age appropriate, again, we can see how this plays into the worry cycle of us as parents counteracting our child's need for independence and autonomy with some counterproductive feeding practices. While this might seem like the natural response for us as parents, this can also generate some fear in our kids. Things like fear of being pressured to eat, fear of not knowing whether they'll have something at the table that they like to eat or that they enjoy eat. They might have fear of new foods being offered in general and not feel that they're able to say no or turn down the foods that are being offered if they feel a fear of new foods, often called neophobia. It also might be a fear of disappointing you. They may begin, as they get a little bit older, to identify feelings of incompetence where they cannot meet your expectations for them, and this often happens at the table, where they can see very clear pleasure or disappointment from you as the parent, depending on what counterproductive feeding practices you've been using. Additionally, we want to consider what type of anxiety our child might have based on any sensory-based anxiety, or if they had a medical history that compromise their ability to be able to eat adequately by mouth. And oftentimes We can assume that our child's pickiness is behavioral and by choice, which can frustrate us and create us or compel us to adopt some counterproductive feeding behaviors. But something for us to remember here is that oftentimes a child's feeding anxiety or anxiety around food can be related to their picky eating and actually be something that's a biological deficit that we'll talk about in upcoming weeks. And this might be that they had an oral motor skill deficit where they weren't physically able to eat and they couldn't even meet the expectations that we had for them. So although we will go ahead and dive into more of the concerns with a feeding deficit or oral motor feeding challenges playing into the continuum of picky eating in week 4 when we have a feeding specialist joining us, I want to go ahead and identify right now what we can control and what we can begin to evaluate. And that would be to look at the interplay of anxieties on feeding and eating and to recognize if and how this has been playing into our feeding relationship with our child and how we ourselves and our child overall relate with food. Since feeding is something that we have to do several times a day, we often in our worry attempt to do it right and we push harder and we create new counterproductive feeding dynamics that unfortunately end up causing our children to push back even more rather than to press in and to succeed with the approaches that we're using. So by addressing both our own insecurities and anxieties around eating as well as our children's, we can begin to see how quickly mealtimes can take a shift for the worse when things have begun to get out of balance. Our goal, of course, is not to stay here in this place where we see that mealtimes are out of balance, but rather to understand some of the reasons and some of the underpinnings to why meals are anxious and tense and stressful and unpleasant for everyone right now, so that we can begin to identify those things that are unique to our families and our unique challenges and our underlying anxieties, so that we can customize and make this process as unique as possible so that it's as specific to our family's struggles and challenges as needed. So let's address why this anxiety matters and how we see it show up at the table. Something that can be very helpful for parents to realize is that when a child faces anxiety around eating, and that might be their own anxiety based off some of the reasons that we discussed, or it may be that they can sense the anxiety that we feel towards feeding, and that becomes their own anxiety at the table as well. And when that anxiety is experienced by the child, the physiological response would be for it to shut down their appetite. So as a parent, if we are feeling anxious towards our child not eating, we may inadvertently be helping to curb their appetite all by ourselves, by the perceived pressure and by the anxiety that they face, and that anxiety shutting down their appetite. When a child doesn't have an appetite, they don't eat. When a child doesn't eat, we see that our anxiety is again continues the worry cycle another round. When a parent feels this anxiety around a child not eating, that's when we begin to adopt those maladaptive responses that we talked about in that initial slide with the worry cycle. When those maladaptive responses go from maybe being here or there or occasional responses to becoming those that are regularly used, we begin to use external motivators as the driving force required for our child to eat. When those external motivations are the primary motivation for our child to eat, we have missed opportunities in feeding our children. And this is what we really need to see. When we get to feed our children up to 3 to 5 times a day, 7 days a week after week, year after year, that can be a lot of missed opportunity where the maladaptive behaviors get reinforced instead of those that would promote and create new opportunity. Some of the missed opportunities that can happen are the chance to promote internal motivations to eat, such as an innate ability to see your own hunger and appetite and satiety and to self-regulate for our children. Another missed opportunity when this cycle continues is that we miss an opportunity to cultivate eating competence within our child, for them to understand how to enjoy meal times without pressure, to enjoy food and eat until the feeling of being satisfied, or to pass on eating if it's not a satisfying experience for them. Each of these missed opportunities can continue to play into why meals are an unpleasant experience for everyone and why our child is not eating. I know that many of you are probably wondering why we're spending the first 20 minutes of the Academy even talking about all of these anxieties. However, from having done this with hundreds and hundreds of different families, I've seen how these anxieties play into each and every family's feeding relationship. As I mentioned before, these are some of the first things that I can identify in a family and the biggest underlying factors to why a family can continue to succeed and find progress, because they've dealt with these anxieties and found appropriate adaptive behaviors for them, or because they have not addressed these anxieties and underlying fears and worries for the feeding relationship and are not able to adapt appropriately and instead fall back on maladaptive behaviors. And so something I just wanted to share before we jump into counterproductive and productive feeding approaches is this quote from Ellen Satter. Ellen Satter runs the Ellen Satter Institute and is the creator of the Division of Responsibility and evidence-based model that we will talk thoroughly about in the next section. But a quote I wanted to share with you here that I thought would be a good remark in closing is this, and that's that your attitudes about eating can make or break you. Unlike what we think, our conscious judgment, attitudes are based on feelings and beliefs, both often unexamined. Attitudes are generally subtle and implied rather than spoken right out loud, and are in fact often hard to pin down, but they affect you nonetheless. They control your behavior, influence the way you feel, and dictate your priorities. And just like with the interplay of anxieties in other areas of our life, we can see that this interplay of anxieties can have an impact on our feeding relationship with our kids.